Welcome to Religion Off the Beaten Track with Robin Douglas, a podcast on the lesser-known aspects of religion and belief.
Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of Religion Off the Beaten Track. I'm your host, Robin Douglas, and with us here today is Father Tom Plant of Rikkyo University in Tokyo. Father Plant is a priest of the Church of England, coming from the Catholic tradition of the Church. Father Plant, welcome and thanks for being with us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, today we're going to be talking about several different things. We're going to be talking about Christian mysticism, the Platonist tradition of philosophy, and Shin Buddhism. And indeed, you've written a book entitled The Lost Way to the Good, in which you explore the interaction between those various themes. Can I start by asking you how personally you came to your interest in these subjects? Because I imagine that there might be an assumption that you were a Christian priest who became interested in Buddhism, but I believe it was actually the other way around, and that it was Buddhism that you became interested in initially before going into the priesthood.
Yes, you're absolutely right, and I could go on about this for ages. I'll try to condense it into a nutshell, as it were. Yes, basically, I was brought up in a pretty much a non-religious family, and went to Church of England primary school and secondary school, but nothing really grabbed my attention about the Christian faith through those particular media, I suppose. And by the age of 18, I was proudly proclaiming myself a card-carrying atheist, and at times veered towards Marxism, and was probably unbearably pretentious with it. So I think my school chaplain, whom I loved, despite my differing views with, called me a militant heathen. The good old Reverend Ronald Darroch, may he rest in peace. And like so many, I think, of that age, I protested too much, really, because what's written out of that little scheme is that actually, at the age of 13 or 14, I went off with a Jewish friend. His mother was training to be a rabbi in the progressive tradition. Went off to a religious conference of Jews, Christians, and Muslims in Germany, and heartily enjoyed it. And very much thought I might take religious studies for A level, but in the end prompted for Latin, Greek, and French. But I was interested. But I didn't really want anyone to know. So 4 years at St Andrews, really trying to persuade as many people as possible that there's definitely no such thing as God, and if there is, he's evil, and making Christians cry to my shame. I went off to Japan after that for a couple of years. I'd been practicing Aikido. Curiously, a friend from St Andrews, a priest's son, said, "Hey, this Aikido thing, what's all this key stuff you're talking about? Sounds a bit like religion to me." And I was, I protested very heartily that was not the case. Just physics, all just physics. But actually, the cliche of practicing martial arts with a Buddhist monk, finding yourself in the Far East after you've graduated on your gap year. I'm sorry, I am that cliche. I actually did practice Aikido with a Buddhist monk in Kochiken, and conversations with him started to open my mind to the possibility of things beyond the material and beyond the evidence of the senses. As did conversations with a Christian who I knew in Japan at the time, Paul Robbins, and my sort of broadly theist friend and partner in mostly drink-related crime, David Schmaltz, who lived in the flat beneath me in Japan, and their conversations, the conversation with the Buddhist monk, the practice of Aikido, and falling in love with the woman who would become my wife, the cracks in my rationalist, materialist armour really began to show, and the light began to pour through. Went back to Blighty, not intending to teach, but I did at a cathedral school, which was definitely not my intention. When the head teacher asked me, am I at least, if not sympathetic, at least not antipathetic towards the Christian faith, I found myself sheepishly admitting that actually I was quite interested at this point. I'd even in Japan sneaked around one of the Tsutaya bookshops in Osaka, and I'd been looking at the top shelf like some sort of teenager in the local filling station at Bibles, and surreptitiously bought one and was reading it with great interest. My grandfather read the Bible every day. It's a Christadelphian, in fact. I always admired him greatly. All these people, just struck me as I vaguely got over sort of my adolescent hubris that perhaps all these really intelligent and articulate people, like my old school chaplain Ronald Darroch, and like my grandfather, and like these people I knew in Kochi, and indeed my wife, and I saw people like Rowan Williams, who I hadn't really come across. Perhaps actually they might be worth listening to. I met a young deacon in Exeter, where I was teaching at cathedral school, Father John Hughes, whom some of your listeners may know. Read at his first mass, and he's a brilliant. He was a brilliant young man, and again coming into his company and the company of other Christians at very Anglo-Catholic Church, St Michael's Mount Dinham. Yeah, that changed my perspective considerably, and where I had been sort of knocking around Shinto shrines and Buddhist temples, trying to recapture some of this sense of this. Well, I had basically a religious experience, kind of experience of light. So I won't go too much into that now, but try to recapture some sense of that. Instead, back in England, St Michael's was offering Vespers and meditation. Well, I had no idea what Vespers was, but meditation sounded good. And I found myself very much drawn into this strange little corner of Anglicanism, in which I still revel and rejoice. Confraternity of the Blessed Sacrament. I found myself going to one of their benedictions. Again, I had no idea what it was. What's that white thing in the gold thing that the priest in the big cloak is waving around? Don't know. Love it. And it was really from that kind of visceral response that I got drawn to Christianity, and I thought I want to make intellectual sense of how this ties in with what I've been reading about Buddhism. And so, being the sort of person I am, I thought I'll take a master's. Let's do that. So I went off to Gavin Costa in Bristol and said, you do interfaith stuff. How about taking me on? And he said, well, you read classics, not theology. Do me 3 essays on these topics. If they're any good, then I'll take you on. So we did. And I started looking at Henri de Lubac, Hans Urs von Balthasar, and Karl Rahner. I really wanted to focus on Shinran, even then, thanks to Henri de Lubac and his work on what he called Amidism, Amida Buddhism. But, a master's thesis doesn't quite allow that scale. So that's where it all started off. And dear Professor Paul Williams at Bristol also, he taught me Buddhism while I was there for the year I was doing the masters. And he'd fairly recently to Roman Catholicism after about 20 years as a Buddhist. And he particularly rated Shinran. So Shin Buddhism, partly because that was my wife's school of Buddhism, partly because of Henri de Lubac, partly because of Professor Paul Williams. But that led me eventually on when I was finally baptized at the age of 25. And then a couple of years later, 3 years later, I think actually, started pursuing formation for the priesthood to look at a PhD much more specifically on the teachings of Shinran and the Neoplatonism of Dionysius.
One thing that strikes me from your story, and as you say, it's something that's not unusual for young people in the West, is that you looked to the East for spiritual inspiration. The East is often seen in this rather outmoded, perhaps colonialist way, as being the home of mystery and spirituality. But in fact, in Europe, in the cultural West, we have a mystical tradition of our own, which is the equal to anything anywhere else in the world. And that can be traced back in many ways to Plato and Platonist philosophy. This would be a good point of entry, I think, to your work. If we start with Plato and the Platonist tradition, this, of course, starts before the advent of Christianity. How would you sum up the Platonist tradition and where that's coming from? It's an enormous question, of course, but if you could put it in a nutshell, what is Platonism and Plato's philosophy?
Platonic philosophy is really the love of wisdom in application and in spiritual application. I think one of the dangers of approaching Platonism from too narrowly intellective a stance is that we lose sight of that. I think we want to characterize Platonism simply. It's anti-nominalist and anti-materialist. Things are not as they are just because we call them so. Things are never just a cultural or social construct. There are real, non-physical, extramental ideas, also called forms, which are necessary for the existence of any of the material realm. At one level, there's a certain skepticism. And Socrates is, I suppose, the arch skeptic, isn't he, in a way? A skepticism of the evidence of the senses. And so the Socratic dialogues, he claims to know nothing and to say nothing, but only to question, to buzz around like a gadfly, disrupting other people's knowledge.
The context of this is that Socrates is the hero of many of Plato's dialogues.
Yeah, absolutely. But there was never, there was never a consensus that Platonism is mere cynicism, because while the Platonic tradition does indeed call into question the evidence of the senses, it does so to emphasize the reliability of knowledge which is beyond the senses. Much of it is to do with memory and imagination and innate knowledge. I think when Plato is speaking at his highest, he speaks in myths. The myths he uses are of a, might we say, a mystical, certainly a spiritual and even a religious variety, which lift one beyond the realm of matter towards the eternal laws which are true, regardless of whether the material realm follows them or not. What is intelligible. And therefore, the cause of what is and is intelligible must itself be beyond being and beyond intelligibility. So there is, without doubt, something which the Neoplatonists will call the one, the good, and often even God, which is not one big thing among many others. It's not a big version of us. But God is, the one is beyond all existence and knowledge, and yet the source of both.
This is a very radically transcendent view, isn't it, of Godhead? Yes and
no. That depends on who you ask. Yes, it is, but simultaneously, it is also radically immanent. There are, now what I've tried to identify in my book, and it's, I'm not being original in this, is you could say there are two broad strands of Platonism. One, which I suppose we might, if people are familiar with more modern philosophy, one might associate with Descartes, where you have a clear dualism, of mind and body, matter and spirit. And Plotinus is more of a kind of that dualistic strand, where there are intimations that the matter, the body, the world are inferior to the spirit. Not just intimations, that much is clear, but sometimes there are intimations that matter, the body, etc., are actually evil and pulling us away from the good. And that's one reading of Platonism. But then you've also got the more Eastern strand of Platonism, which is characterized by Iamblichus, who gave himself an Egyptian priest's name and was a pagan priest himself, and Proclus, and which is picked up by Dionysius the Areopagite in the Christian tradition, which is less dualistic. I would even go so far as to say non-dualistic strand. Not monistic, not saying the world, the universe, matter is God or vice versa, but rather that the material realm is an emanation of the divine, and therefore in all, we rise to the good, we are liberated, as it were, not from our bodies, not from the world, but through the world. And materiality and physicality are blessed and indeed an essential ladder to the good. So the body is essential for our spiritual development, is one way of putting it.
Okay. And this is a strand of thought which is associated with Iamblichus, Proclus, people who are pagan figures. Although, as you say, there's also Dionysius, the Christian philosopher. And figures like Iamblichus write about things like ritual and what we might today call magic.
Theurgy.
Indeed, indeed. For the sake of clarity, how would you define theurgy?
Divine work, and theo ergon, the work of God, effected by human hands, and in particular, for Dionysius, that's baptism, it's the Eucharist and anointing, where the grace of God is operative. The divine is through the hands of the priest and the prayers of the people, each in their proper order and to their proper extent. But it is the distinction between human work and God's work breaks down, but the priority is always with God. It's God working through his church and through his creation. Certainly not magic in the sense of us manipulating God, but magic in a way. I suppose it's like Tolkien or Lewis's deep magic.
This might seem to be rather foreign to what most of us think of as being Christianity, certainly those of us who live in Protestant countries. But you're drawing a link, am I right, between that strand of thought and the more Catholic variety of Christianity that sees the sacraments as being physical channels of encounter with the divine.
Very much so, and I don't claim to be doing anything particularly novel there. If the novelty is to bring it into the dialogue with Shin Buddhism, but pseudo Dionysius, possibly Syrian, certainly pseudonymous monk of around the roughly 6th century, takes on Proclus sometimes word for word and adopts a lot of the terminology of Iamblichus. Takes on the theurgic principles which Iamblichus outlines, that humans do not manipulate the divine, rather that material things become channels for the divine, and all things speak something of the divine. And there's debate among Eastern Orthodox scholars in particular about to what extent Dionysius radically alters this, or to what extent he baptizes it. One way or another, it's inescapable that he's influenced by it and makes of it, or takes over it, takes over from it, depending on perspective. Christian sacramental theology, which has been influential both in the West and the East, much more obviously so, I think, nowadays in Eastern Christianity. If you look at Losky or Olivier Clement, they will cite Dionysius left, right, and centre, not always with approbation. In the West, though, Thomas Aquinas, I think it's right to say Dionysius was, I think he quotes him even more than Augustine. I need to check it again. But partly that's because he really did think that Dionysius was the convert of St. Paul in Athens, whereas really Dionysius was writing a few 500 years later. So there was a kind of quasi-apostolic authority.
The context of this is that Dionysius claimed to be one of the characters in the Bible in the Book of Acts who St. Paul had personally met in Athens and converted to Christianity. That's
right. Dionysius writes in character.
Yeah.
The question is, of course, why? The problem there is that this raises a lot of suspicion about Dionysius when we see his pseudonymity in terms of kind of modern ideas of authorial intent. Luther famously, talk about Protestant nations. Luther famously, talked about Dionysius, whoever he was, i.e., don't bother with him. Let's ignore all that claptrap. A skeptical mindset would say, well, he wants to take apostolic, just sub-apostolic authority for himself and his strange Platonic ideas. He's trying to sneak in Platonism under a chasuble, and you hear that from some, quite a number of 20th century scholars in particular. Others, including Pope Emeritus Benedict, who I think whose views I take pretty seriously, would really very heartily differ with that. And he and others as well, Hieromonk Golitsyn among them, see Dionysius' pseudonymity as very much part and parcel of his theological method. That makes sense to me. Why would you try to acclaim apostolic authority and fame for yourself by making yourself pseudonymous so nobody knows who you are for the next 15 centuries, and we're never likely to know who he is. And why, if you were truly Christian faithful, would you want to do that? Well, I think part of the answer is that they didn't have the same ideas of plagiarism and so on as we do. It seems to me that Dionysius, in taking on the persona of Pseudo-Dionysius, is entering more into the hiddenness, the divine hiddenness that he extols so much in his theology. The idea, the famous negative way, the via negativa, the apophatic path of denying the names of God, the attributes of God, in order, those which are positively proclaimed, deny them in order to ascend beyond knowledge to the God who is indeed beyond knowledge and beyond being, as far as Dionysius is concerned. That comes out in his origin story, if you like, in Acts 17, where Paul goes into the Agora and he sees all the statues. There are a load of idols. There's the statue to the unknown gods, which I can imagine is this empty plinth. That's the God that I'm proclaiming to you. You Platonists and Stoics, you worship this unknown God. It's the God who's revealed himself in Jesus Christ. Dionysius is one of the philosophers who converts. Well, that's all part of the same story. All this hiddenness, all this. Mm-hmm. It's not pseudery. It's a great act of humility in a way.
And this notion of apophatic theology, the negative way, the saying that God can't be described and accounted for in words, this is a central aspect, isn't it, of Dionysius's thought?
Certainly is. And until quite recently, far more ink was spilt on that than on his sacramental theurgic theology. Derrida got his teeth into it, and that's going to arouse a lot of interest, as you'd expect. So people looked at the divine names and looked at all the sort of negativity as though a purely intellectual ascent. So back even in the 19th century, Bishop Westcott, founder of my theological college, was somewhat dismissive of Dionysius on the grounds that he was pursuing this individual, solitary, intellectual, spiritual path. Who am I to gainsay Brookfrost Westcott? But when you take the theurgic components, the sacramental components, the very liturgical, hieratic language that he employs elsewhere in his corpus, you can see that for all the negations, the material world mediates the presence of God in a way that leads us beyond mere words and in communion with the church, with others, and with the entirety of the cosmos. So it's very far from a solitary path of mystical ascent.
Would it be fair to say then that Dionysius is the point at which the Platonist tradition of ascent to the one through ritual, which was pioneered by Iamblichus and others, meets the stream of Christian theology, and those two things combine?
I think there are intimations before Dionysius, particularly in Gregory of Nyssa, and the ascent of Moses, again, hieratic language used of bishops, certainly sacramental language. It's Dionysius who really puts it into the theurgic terms more specifically, and that's where that stream, and that's where the theurgic Platonism and Christian sacramental threads intertwine, and the influence becomes more profound.
Okay. So in Dionysius we have this sacramental, theurgical, apophatic tradition which draws on Christianity and Platonism. And if we take that and then we look over to Shin Buddhism, what are the points of contact?
Sure. I mean, historically, nothing concrete at all. You could look at Gandhara and sort of Indian, certain interlinks with Indian thought. And actually, the ancient Platonists, they claimed inheritance not just from Greece by any stretch of the imagination. They claimed via the Pythagoreans, in particular, connections to Indian thought. They also claimed influence from Egypt and indeed from Moses and the Jewish tradition, because the Israelites were captive in Egypt. So they claimed to be part of a much wider intellectual and religious philosophical tradition. So Shin Buddhism, like all Buddhism, has its origins in India, and so it shouldn't be entirely surprising to find that although they are alien traditions to a great extent, there is, if you go back far enough, going to be some common ancestry. And one of the things I want to try to do with my book is to put up some resistance against the idea that religions can just be neatly divided off between East and West and then packaged up into little denominations, divided and conquered, and we're all just standing on our own individual mountains shouting at each other. Don't believe that any more than I believe that it's all paths up the same mountain. It's the whole problem of who defines what the mountain is. And anyway, especially if the mountain's beyond being and non-being, either of those ways is problematic. But okay, Dionysian tradition and Shin Buddhism, in a way, they're both outliers. That's how I see it. Insofar as Dionysian Platonism brings a non-dualistic emphasis to a Christian tradition that can be very dualistic, particularly since I think this is exaggerated after Duns Scotus and William of Ockham, the idea of God out there as a separate great being lording it over us all. Whereas in Shin Buddhism, Buddhism is often portrayed as at least non-dualistic, sometimes even monistic, and monistic might be true, for example, of Zen. But Shin Buddhism has been accused by other Buddhists of being dualistic and therefore problematic, because it's called Shin Buddhism. It comes from Jodo Shin Shu. Jodo Shu is Pure Land Buddhism. Jodo Shin Shu is true Pure Land Buddhism. I wonder if I need to say something about the origins of Shin Buddhism before I talk about the similarities or the conceptual overlap between the two.
Please do, yes.
Sure. Okay. Well, medieval Kyoto, 12th century, there have been fires and earthquakes. The chronicler Kamano Chome writes in his from his little square hut, which he calls his hojoki, that there were piles of corpses of cows and bulls up against the side of the Kamor River, so deep that horses and carts couldn't pass. It's a time of complete catastrophe. And in this catastrophe, Buddhist scholars start to agree that Mappo has come. This is the end of the Dharma age of Shakyamuni Buddha, the historical Buddha that we all know as the Buddha in the West, Gautama Siddhartha Buddha. And that somehow we either need to recover the authentic original teachings, or we need to look to the coming Buddha, whose influence will be more pronounced in the next Dharma age. So the founder of Zen Buddhism, Dogen, he thinks we need to go back to the pristine teachings. He goes out to China, finds Chan Buddhism, which then becomes Zen Buddhism, pure sitting, and master-to-teacher transmission of meditative technique. From the same monastery on Mount Hiei, outside Kyoto, you've then got Nichiren, who takes refuge in the Lotus Sutra. Says that the chanting of the Lotus Sutra will bring enlightenment, and actually the most famous offshoot of that is now the Soka Gakkai, known worldwide. But then you've got this other one from the same monastery called Honen, and his disciple Shinran. Now they instead find refuge in, it is an old tradition, comes from probably at the latest, I think, 4th century, although the Indian sources are not extant, there are Chinese ones. Pure Land's teaching, the Pure Land of Amitabha or Amida Buddha. Now, that had always been part of Buddhist teaching, the idea that after this life, you may go to a Buddha's Pure Land, a kind of Buddha's heavenly sphere for further teaching, and then return to another life, and so on, until you sever the karmic ties which bind you to death and rebirth. What Honen and Shinran did was say, well, no, actually, this coming Buddha, Amida Buddha, there's sufficient scriptural evidence to suggest that our own methods, our own meditation, all of that, they can't do anything for us. all we can do is rely completely on the boundless karmic merits of the Buddha of the current age, Amitabha Buddha, the Buddha of boundless compassion and wisdom. And so they coined this term tariki, other power. Instead of relying on jiriki, your self-power, which was the teaching of Zen, these are contemporaries of Dogen, they're saying, no, you have to rely on tariki, the other power, the grace, if you like, of Amida Buddha. And I use that word advisedly. I also use the word advisedly for salvation, because they actually do say, taskeru, save. It's not me putting a Christian gloss onto what they're saying. Brief history, when the Jesuits arrived, as made famous by, Endo Shusaku's novel Silence, they thought the Lutherans had beaten to it. Sounded too much like salvation by faith alone, have faith in the Buddha, Shinjin, deep in trusting. There's no evidence of Christian influence on Shinran or Honen. It can be, their thought can be explained in terms of classic Buddhist no-self doctrine. By the 20th century, you've got the likes of, Madame Blavatsky and Crispus Humphreys, who are discovering Buddhism, this wonderful exotic thing from the East. They don't like True Pure Land or Pure Land Buddhism, Shin Buddhism, because, it all seems a bit too much like that awful Christian stuff we're trying to get away from. Faith, it's some kind of hick cousin of Buddhism. It doesn't deserve our attention. So there were certain orientalizing assumptions about it. And actually, I won't go into it now, it's in the book, but you can look at how Japanese Buddhists also try to reframe their own Shin Buddhism into terms that were more readily appreciable by Western audiences, and also help them to bond more firmly with other Buddhists to resist Western missionary endeavors and to resist the growth of nationalistic Shinto. So all sorts of things conspired to kind of push Shin Buddhism to the edges of both Japanese and consciousness and the consciousness of the rest of the world, despite the fact that it accounts for more than 60% of the Japanese people. More than 60% will have Shin Buddhist little shrine in their house. So on the one hand, you've got the Shin Buddhists being sort of accused of a kind of dualism, and then you've got Christian Platonism being accused of almost pantheism, maybe verging on monism. And I thought, okay, let's get these outliers on their traditions. They're not really outliers; they're actually big in their own way, but they've been pushed to the fringes intellectually for various reasons. Let's put them together.
And how do you see the two traditions as fitting together? What's the common factor?
A non-dualism with a priority towards the transcendent. A modified non-dualism would be the commonality that I see. And the transcendent being good, expressed in similar terms of light and compassion and wisdom, which is beyond ratiocinative apprehension, beyond knowledge either of the realm of the senses or even of the higher logical faculties of reasoning, but for which both of those faculties are necessary to obtain any kind of taste of or experience of. Now, in Shin Buddhism, that's articulated in terms of something called the Nembutsu. It's the chanting of the Buddha's name. But what's of theological or philosophical interest is that this is not, absolutely not, just saying the name, asking the Buddha's for his salvific grace, as a self-other relationship. Rather, it's perceived as Amida Buddha speaking Buddha's own name through the practitioner, which has resonances with the theurgic idea that true sacramental worship is the act of God through the worshippers. That worship of God is, in some way, God's worship of God's self through the created order, that all of creation is a paean to God, a great chorus and hymn of praise. And that is something that these traditions with minimal historical contact have, I find surprising commonality. Enough commonality to say that we are not engaged on totally different quests. And what we are engaged in is much closer to one another than either of what us, Shin Buddhists or sacramental Catholic Christians, closer to one another than we are to the whims of secular modernity, considerably closer. And so I think the secular strategy of dividing religions up in an encyclopedic way is something that we can resist when we realize that we have rather more in common.
Okay. And there have certainly been people such as yourself who have written about Shin Buddhism from a Christian point of view, and Henri de Lubac was someone else you mentioned in that regard. Do we find Japanese Shin Buddhist scholars looking at the tradition of Platonist Christianity, Dionysius and so forth, and yes, they draw that comparison too? Yes.
Certainly there were Shin and not only Shin Buddhists, but Buddhist scholars in what's known as the Kyoto school, mid-20th century, some of whom were very much influenced by Platonic thought. More recently, John Paraskevopoulos is an Australian Shin Buddhist priest who is influenced in similar ways. Kenneth Tanaka, I think, is as well. Over here in Tokyo. There is a common interest in Platonism, and in particular Neoplatonism. Yes. And at the same time, there's also Shin Buddhist polemic against Christianity as there is Christian polemic against Shin Buddhism. And part of that is because Shin Buddhists don't want to be seen as, they don't want Shinran to be seen as just another Luther. They don't want Shin Buddhism to be seen as liberal Protestantism without the awkward bits about Jesus and miracles, and there is a tendency to see Shin Buddhism like that in the West. It's Christianity without all the objectionable bits. Well, Shin Buddhists don't want to be seen as Christianity without the objectionable bits, and they're not. So there can be a tendency in Shin Buddhist scholarship to stress the dualism of Christianity, which is true of some forms of Christianity, but not of all Christianity, and I would argue, well, from where I'm standing, not of what Christianity was ever meant to be.
Well, that seems like a good note on which to close. Thank you very much for being with us, Father Plant, and I would commend your book, The Lost Way to the Good, to anyone who's interested in these subjects. Father Plant, thank you for being with us.
Thank you ever so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
You have been listening to Religion Off the Beaten Track with Robin Douglas. Remember to follow us on Twitter and Facebook.